I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. I'm here with Paul Jernberg. Nice to see you, Paul.
Good to see you, David.
Okay. Paul will be well known to regular listeners of this podcast. He is one of the leading composers of sacred music today, I would say, and has a lot of very interesting thoughts and ideas on what you might call the philosophy of sacred music and its place in the church. I've invited him back again today because I read a blog post of his in which he was exploring more deeply the ways in which we can define what sacred music is exactly. Regular listeners will have heard us refer to Pius X's criteria. We're going to come back to that. And as I pointed out to Paul in discussions, in the end, it's a matter of judgment as to what those are. They help us somewhat, but not completely. And so we're going to discuss how we can start to develop more helpful criteria, shall we say, or more narrower criteria from that starting point. Before we do so, Paul, would you just tell us, just to remind people about your organization and where people can get hold of you, and especially those who want to commission works of music from one of our leading composers, where they can get in touch with you. So just tell us that first of all, just to remind people who you are and what you do.
Well, my work is supported by a nonprofit organization called Magnificat Institute of Sacred Music. And we're located here in Lancaster, Massachusetts.
Okay.
And people can reach me, yep. And the mission of Magnificat Institute is for the renewal of sacred music in the Catholic Church, basically. It's a very broad mission, but which we have very specific projects aimed to fulfill that. And I can be reached either through one of two websites, either pauljernberg.com or magnificatinstitute.org. Both of those websites work to reach me.
Right.
And
the thing that I would say is that on the whole, you welcome people writing to you and asking questions and discussion. I mean, my experience is that you love to engage with people in these ideas. So don't hesitate. I hope I'm not unleashing millions of emails into your inbox. I suspect not. I don't think we're that influential here in the Way of Beauty. But I think those that come to you will have interesting things to say.
yes.
Okay, so let's get into it. What is sacred music? You sent me an email with an outline, just remember, you said, not sure if I should briefly relate the story of saving the Obelisk being moved into St. Peter's Square. Well, that in itself is just an intriguing statement. So without knowing whether it's even relevant, why don't you tell us the story of saving the Obelisk being moved into St. Peter's Square?
Right, and there is there's a strong connection. But in the 16th century, the St. Peter's Square St. Peter's was renovated, and they constructed the present St. Peter's Square. And part of that project to do that was to bring in this Egyptian obelisk, which had been brought to Rome by Caligula, many centuries before Christ, and not many centuries before Christ, but the obelisk had been there a long time. It was apparently there when St. Peter was crucified upside down. But this obelisk was brought, the idea was to bring it to the middle of St. Peter's Square, where it is today. Pope Sixtus was the one who was doing this project. So anyway, it was a real big endeavor to move this obelisk because it's so heavy and it's very long, and they had to have hundreds of men and horses and winches and all sorts of things to make this happen. So much so that the Pope ordered that everyone be totally silent while the obelisk was being moved, because the engineer who was organizing it said, this is so sensitive, we have to be really focused, so please, no noise whatsoever. So believe it or not, the Pope actually imposed the death penalty on anybody who would talk during and so it was completely quiet. Anyway, so here comes the obelisk in with all these horses and people and ropes and so forth. And things are going fine for a while, but then the obelisk starts swaying, and this sailor who's there, his name is Benedetto Brescia, he noticed that the ropes were starting to fray, and he knew how to solve that problem. But in fact, if he was quiet, the ropes would have broken, the obelisk would have smashed down, it would have been a catastrophe. But so instead, he defied the Pope's order, and he yelled out in his Ligurian dialect, "Water on the ropes, water on the ropes," because he knew this as a sailor, this is what you do to strengthen the ropes so they don't fray. And fortunately, the men there, they obeyed. They threw water on the ropes, and the ropes were strengthened, and the project was saved. So because he had defied the Pope's orders, he was brought to Pope Sixtus, and who did not in any way punish him, but instead asked what he could be given as a reward. And as legend has it, Benedetto asked for the right to provide the palms for Palm Sunday, and that in his little town has provided the palms for Palm Sunday since that time, with just a very brief interruption in that. So now that might seem to be a strange analogy to sacred music, but I'm going to bring it together in a few minutes.
Okay, go ahead.
And I can say right now that part of the dilemma, you might say, is what do we do when we see something that seems to be being led in a wrong direction by the church authorities? What do we do in that situation? And I've talked a lot about silence in my blogs and podcasts, but in this particular blog, there's also a time to shout out, as Benedetto did. So now I need to go back a step and talk again about the definition of sacred music. Up until really the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, there was a pretty clear understanding that when we talk about sacred music in the Catholic Church, we really mean that what the original meaning of that word sacred means, which is consecrated. This is music that has been specifically consecrated for use in the liturgy. And that's what distinguishes it from music that's outside of the liturgy. So you have this idea of sacred and profane. And sacred and profane not being a bad thing, it just simply meaning outside the temple.
Yeah. Sacred
meaning inside the temple, that which is appropriate for use in the liturgy itself. And so this is the whole basis upon which we have our church documents, such as the Sacrosanctum Concilium, chapter 6, talks about sacred music. This is the whole, that's the point. What about this music in the liturgy? And that's implied then also with Musica Sacra, which is the post-conciliar document. Pope Pius also goes on to say in the introduction to his Motu Proprio, 1903, that he sort of states the obvious, which is that this sacred music, which is appropriate for the liturgy, is intended to clothe the sacred text. right? So it distinguishes it from music. We might just think, well, this is a beautiful piece, and that's, you know, this seems fitting, but no, the whole focus of sacred music for centuries has been the idea of clothing the text that is not our own invention, but which is handed down to us. And so that's the original definition. Now, here's the problem that comes in, because if we jump to Musica Sacra, we read the following statement. I'm going to read it verbatim here, the English translation. And it says, by sacred music is understood that which, being created for the celebration of divine worship, is endowed with a certain holy sincerity of form. Okay, we might say so far so good, but then the following come under the title of sacred music here: Gregorian chant, sacred polyphony in its various forms, both ancient and modern, sacred music for the organ and other approved instruments, and sacred popular music, be it liturgical or simply religious. Now, as you can see, that's not maybe a strict definition, but it's giving a description that's bringing in some new ideas. And because previously, whenever we talked about religious music, that means in church document, what it means is it's music that's good and appropriate, but not fitting in the liturgy, right? That's the whole meaning of that term. You can see that throughout the teaching of the church. Interestingly, this quote here that this last quote from Musicam Sacram, where it lists these different kinds of music, it's almost a direct quote from another document in 1958, which was issued when Pius XII was dying. And by that I don't mean to imply anything sinister, but the Congregation for Divine Worship issued a document back in 1958 saying this list here, where sacred music can be considered all these kinds of things. But in that same document, it makes clear a little bit later on, say, but of course, religious music is not for the liturgy. So what we have here is a fuzziness that's coming into play, which, you know, reading this once or twice or even 5 times, you might think, well, what's the big deal? But then if as an educator or as a person really trying to understand this, if we try to have any kind of precision with our definition, we see that the definition has lost its clear limits. Because now it's almost like we're saying sacred music includes both consecrated and non-consecrated music. So we seem to be contradicting ourselves. So this is, for anybody who looks at this clearly, David, this becomes a little bit problematic. And so what most people that I've heard speak about this today, what they'll say now is this, and it's following this Musicam Sacram. I think this is where they get it. They'll say, well, of course, sacred music is much bigger than liturgical music, right? It's, you know, all sorts of things. You can have this great classical piece, or this great this instrumental piece, this choral work. It may not have a liturgical text. It may not be meant for the liturgy, but yet it's sacred because here we have this list, right? And I think that trying to understand this it seems to be, you might say, a concession to our culture, in which the culture today, or maybe the last 50, 100 years, I don't know, has thought of sacred in more of a subjective sense. Like, wow, that does something to me. It's numinous. It inspires me. Therefore, it must be sacred. But you see, that's a different approach from the objective idea of this is music that's consecrated for the liturgy and particularly suited for the liturgy. So here we've got what seems to me to be a problem on our hands of conflict of definitions. And a lot of people solve that problem simply by calling the music for the liturgy now either liturgical music or sacred liturgical music. That way you sort of get around the problem because you use both terms. I think liturgical music, that term is problematic for various reasons I won't go into right now. Sacred liturgical music works, but it's very wordy. Let's try to look at Musicam Sacram a little bit more clearly to see what exactly the intention is. Now, some people will just throw it out. You know, some people, and this is a certain movement we see today, is like, hey, problems with Vatican II, problems with these documents, just go back, you know, before they were ever written and take that as your basis. But I think I don't know if that's fully Catholic to do it that way. I think we need to say, is there an important message in Musicam Sacram, even if there's problems here? Interestingly, as I quoted before, Musicam Sacram talks about sacred music as having a certain holy sincerity of form. Now that sounds very interesting, but anybody who's looked into this a little more deeply might wonder, well, what does that mean? What, you know, that's fascinating. Sincerity of form, but holy. But so looking at the Latin, and interestingly, you have to dig to find the Latin version of this. Now, why that is, I don't know, but it is out there. If you dig hard enough, you'll find it. And the Latin that is quoted is a direct.
The Latin version of Musicam Sacra.
Yeah, the Latin version, which is the authoritative version.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a direct quote from Pius X, a direct quote stating his first two qualities, which are holiness and goodness of forms or beauty. And so it's puzzling, but that's the intention there. That in the original is actually to affirm the foundation that Pius X has laid. But that gets totally lost in translation, unfortunately. So the question is, so what do we do with it? So the other point that comes out is we read clearly, and this is something for me, and I think for many of my colleagues, those of us who are church musicians, these are the kind of documents we want to be immersed in and be thinking about and reflecting upon and you know, meditating. So interestingly, both this document and Sacrosanctum Concilium, they all start by referring to the previous teaching, and particularly to Pius X, is their foundation. So my conclusion in this is that that to take Musicam Sacram by itself is inappropriate. It's got, as all church documents, it's got to be taken in the context of the ongoing tradition and in the hermeneutic of continuity, of which Pope Benedict XVI talks about so much. And when we think of it in that way, things start falling in place. Because, if we think about it as if there's a document that could just break off in a whole new different direction, we're going to have problems. But if we read this in the context of the tradition, we can see that there are important things that we can learn from it. It gives us now I'm approaching this not trying to impute motives or whatever to those who wrote this, but I'm just saying, because the church has been given given authority by Christ to teach, that I think that even if the authors were a little bit mixed up, which it seems like maybe they were a little bit, even if that's the case, it's still something that we should respect and learn from, because it's coming from the church. Just as now, this might be a little bit dramatic comparison, but was it the high priest Caiaphas that said, well, you don't understand anything, that one man needs to die for the whole nation? And he didn't know what he was talking about. But you see, because he was the authoritative teacher, he had something important to say. And I think there's something similar to that here. And I think
I'm
part of
just going to come in here for a second. So
yeah.
Just to summarize what you're saying is, you're trying to, or your assertion is that Musica Sacra is not a break from what Pius X was saying. It's very much in accord with it. But I'm inferring, therefore, or it sounds like that in the background, there is the fact that this has been used to justify things which, in your opinion, go against what Pius, in terms of music choices, when you actually get down. So what is happening is that people are bringing, this reference to popular music, people are interpreting that as meaning whatever's going, popular at the moment in the secular world, and turn it into, and the justification is Musica Sacra. Is that the context? Is that the debate that you're entering into?
Yeah, pretty much. Although I think that the way in which Musica Sacra is worded, especially in its English translation, is problematic. And people talk about a built-in ambiguity, and it's hard not to see that in Musica Sacra. But for somebody who's reading it with piety, which is the way we should always be reading all the documents, then we're okay.
Okay, but, never mind the English translation. I'm ready to believe anything went on in the translation. Okay,
sure.
And it doesn't matter anyway. The easy way to counter that is the point you made. Let's go to the Latin. All right.
Right. That's right.
Now, are those ambiguities there in the Latin too, as well, even but less by degrees? Would you say?
That's right. A little bit less ambiguous, but still there's that sense of ambiguity, because the big problem, as I see it, is maybe an innocent mistake. I don't know, but it's this listing of different kinds of sacred music, and they start out with seems great. Let's start out with Gregorian chant. Okay, let's go on to polyphony, old, traditional and newer. But then they go on to what is clearly been regarded previously as good, but not appropriate to the liturgy. And I think that is, but they're not saying either, it's again, there's ambiguity, because they're not saying, okay, here's our new definition, everybody. Sacred music is no longer consecrated. No, they're not, but they're including this list that just makes things a little bit more.
Okay. So the way to dispel that, it seems to me, is to be clear what we mean by consecrated.
Yeah.
So we say, okay, whatever forms they're suggesting might be appropriate. And what I'm thinking of here is that we don't have anything like as clear direction on art in the, which is the area that I know about. And a lot of people say, I had discussions with people who you know as well, actually, who want, what does the church tell us are the styles? And it simply doesn't.
No.
What it does is define criteria broadly, far more broadly than Pius X did in music.
Right.
And then leave it to choice. And that immediately gives the freedom to do it very badly, and a lot of people do, and a lot of people cynically take advantage of that, and have done.
Right.
At the same time, what it ensures is that you have living and breathing traditions, so that those who are interested in doing it well can be guided by that as well. But it presupposes goodwill, shall we say, and good judgment on the part of the artist. And so my thought is that what you're saying will, shall we say, reassure those whose judgment is good anyway. The question is, how do we tell who's got the good? Everybody thinks they've got good judgment. I mean, I had no training in music, and I think I've got perfect taste, okay? And I think pretty much everybody does. In music, more than anything else, they're prepared to assert their taste. So how do we get through this? Now, my feeling is that these definitions, what they're doing is it's giving the people who feel as you do in regard to the music itself, who I would like to encourage, the reassurance and that under these documents, you do have the freedom to pursue this.
That's right. And I think that's sort of what I was hinting at before, was this idea that's why I think that this Musicum Sacram actually does have some very important new aspects to it. And that exactly in what you're saying is that it does allow a certain freedom that we need, because and hopefully we'll use that freedom. We're obliged to use that freedom with integrity. But it does, whenever you have a situation like this, you open up the possibility of people doing.
And what this won't do, however much we wish it would, is basically shut out the bad popular music, or the music that we hate. Because they will still, I would say with sophistry, I mean, probably they would say with good motive, and so who knows? But they will still be able to justify what they're doing, in my opinion, badly with this language too. So the question then is, what is the value of this? It's broad enough and vague enough that anybody can pick up on it and go where they want. To me, and I'll let you come in after this, the answer is, at the very least, we want to assert that the traditional forms and the traditional interpretation of Pius X has a place there too, and to encourage people to introduce that.
Sure. Yeah, and this is always the tension that there is, because on the one hand, we need to be firmly rooted in tradition. I mean, this is something that's obvious to me as a church musician, is that if somehow we break loose from that and cut ourselves off from those roots, that we're going to inevitably be idiosyncratic or provincial or whatever. We need to have some kind of rooting, okay? But that's the one side. But on the other side, if you need to be open to inspiration and new inspirations that really are going to resonate with people today, right? And so if you're bound, you might say, to only doing Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony, the danger is you're going to fail in your responsibility to resonate with people today, to draw people in to the mystery of the Mass, which is a big part of our calling. So that's and where were we?
Yes. Well, and so so you were narrowing this down then to trying to say, well, what does consecrated mean? Or I was going to push you on that, which seems to be for those with goodwill, they're the only ones we can speak to. We're not going to persuade those who don't want to do this anyway, I think. But for those who are goodwill, this will help guide them to make decisions as to how to exercise that freedom, I'm thinking. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to be consecrated in the way that you're using it?
Yeah, and this is a deep subject. I think that the first aspect of that is to study what it has been historically, and to see that, which is really fascinating to trace the history of the chant that we have in the Roman Rite and also the Eastern rites, and to see that there is this, it's a tradition that's been handed down all the way from the early church, from Christ and the apostles. That, speaking with Jewish scholars and friends and so forth who know something about first century Jewish chant, they tell me that, for sure the Passover would have been chanted. At least there's some question about the words of consecration, because it's a new element that was not in the Passover. But the point is that you have this entity, this phenomenon of consecrated music that is not that has an organic unity to it, right? So if we want to enter into this reality, we've got to first be part of that movement, part of that tradition, and without that, we're stepping outside. So that's now. What I would say beyond that is that a couple things, but one is that we need to look at the principles. So, and this comes from being immersed in the tradition, is that you can see all sorts of things in Gregorian chant, especially in Byzantine chant, and I've written about this extensively in my article called "The Logos of Sacred Music," and in some of my blogs as well. So we need to know the principles as well. There are certain parameters that we need to follow, and some of these are, for example, the use of melody and modes and harmony and rhythm. There's certain characteristics of the sacred music that if we disregard those, we're in trouble. For example, the rhythm is always subordinate to the text. That does not mean there are never any regular rhythms, but the rhythm is and the beat, so to speak, should never be dominant. And when they become dominant, this is something we often hear in music today, is whenever the beat and the subrhythms become catchy and sort of have a life of their own, we've gotten off track. It's just basically, and that's something we could discuss at great length. But
yeah, but what I want to do is just explore further what you mean by off track. So the assumption here is that we're looking at the traditions for which there is a broad consensus in the past, that these are right for the liturgy, and these represent what you call consecrated to the liturgy.
That's right. That's right.
And then what you're doing, and that's something that I couldn't do, I might hear things maybe and identify, but what you can do is analyze those musically in terms of the structures of harmony and counterpoint and this sort of thing, and spot certain universal principles. And
that's correct. Yeah.
When you say we're off track, well, it might be right, it might be wrong. We're down to opinion again. But if we care about tradition and want to be guided by it, even if we're producing a new form, it should still, we would say, the best guideline is that it contains those common elements that you have identified. And you can do that musically, not just linguistically, shall we say, using phrases such as goodness of form. You know what those forms are in terms of musical structures. Okay, good.
Yeah. So now that sounds, like, wow, here we go. Well, we sort of have a formula, don't we? But that even though that helps us when we look at it from the outside, so to speak, there still remains a question for composers. But how do you do this? I mean, it's not mathematics. It's not like you just say, okay, I'm going to take, all these different ingredients, I'm going to put them together, and there I go. I know I've got a wonderful new series. So there's also the element of inspiration, which is absolutely essential. And for that, we need to be committed to this a prayerful approach in which we're always looking for the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And again, that's not. There's a certain what do you call vulnerability or weakness that's inherent in that, because nobody should say, well, here, listen to me, I know that I've got the whole, I've got the monopoly on this. No, but it's as composers approach sacred music in this way, and as we respect the tradition, and as we pray, and as we seek, persistently the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, then I think we can see that this amazing thing is happening, that we're given a gift of new forms, that are in unity with the tradition. And I would say that, again, looking historically, with the development of Gregorian chant itself, for example, way back when in the 3rd, 4th centuries, that's just the beginnings. Of course, chant developed in the following centuries quite a bit as well. But when Latin was first used, the chant that was developed it depended on new inspirations that diverged in a certain way from the Middle Eastern modes and melodies that had started out. Also, in the looking in the Renaissance, now we look back and we say, wow, this Renaissance polyphony seems to be so harmonized, you might say, with chant. I mean, harmonized in the sense of its nature. They fit well together. But that needed certain people to dare to try new things too.
I think we need to finish there. This has been fascinating, but I've got I would like to invite you back. I think we've got a couple more things that we could explore. But I just want to summarize in my own words, what my understanding of what you said, and just throw this back at you. So what you're talking about in isolating these universal forms musically that you're able to discern as someone who is a composer and knows about music in a way that I don't. I'm going to say that this is reasonable to me, that we still need the inspiration. This is not a formula for making beautiful music. It is a formula. It is a formula. In other words, we shouldn't go beyond those criteria, or should we say everything we do should include those criteria? That's probably a better way of putting it. But it's just the same argument that says understanding how to construct sentences and write well does not make you Shakespeare. Knowing all the mathematics of harmony and proportion doesn't make you an artist. You still have to know how to use those things well. And that is the mystery factor that relies on inspiration. And so it occurs to me that there are two things here that I would like to talk to you about, and they have parallels in art. So this will be a little bit more of a to and fro. One is the nature of inspiration and creativity as well, because I think that's something that's woefully misunderstood in the modern age. And in short, everybody thinks that, if I feel it, it comes from God. And so how do we can't discard emotion and feeling altogether, but there are many more things we need to to do. So I would love to talk about that with you, and how for you that process, or the creative process, works. How do you exercise that freedom well, and how do we recognize it? I've got ideas as an artist, and I'd love to talk to you about that, actually. The other thing that occurs to me is that that it's commonly felt that the problem with music in the modern age has arisen from too much freedom. I'm going to assert that actually it's the reverse. It's not enough authentic freedom. This is what we have has been imposed on us largely from above, and the problem is that it's terrible. The problem is perhaps exercise of central control, perhaps too much deferential treatment of what's coming to us from the centre, shall we say, on the part of various parishes and laity. And in fact, if we allowed people that freedom, we talked about this tension between freedom and conformity, shall we say. If we allowed people to work this out, and you had many people trying to address this, I have faith actually that the best rises to the surface. What we have had in the last 60 years is a situation where no one can do that, whether it's traditionalists asserting rigid, and I'm characterizing the extremes here, but on the one hand, traditionalists asserting rigid adherence to the past, modernists asserting a rigid adherence to what comes out of the missalettes, and no one really has any choice. And if you try and introduce something which doesn't conform, if you go against the what has been imposed on us, it's very, very difficult. And actually what we need is more freedom. Freedom, of course, meaning not simply lack of constraints, but with an understanding of the end to which that music is directed. And I think that's something that we could talk about in the future as well, to be honest.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay.
I love it.
All right, Paul. I can't wait till we do that. Let's arrange that as soon as possible. This has been absolutely fascinating. Really difficult subjects to deal with, because it's a nuanced argument that you're making that is easily pigeonholed into something which people will want to counter by creating straw man arguments, I think. So I hope that we did that clearly. Before we say goodbye, I'm just to say thank you very much, Paul. Just tell us again where people can get hold of you and talk to you about this. And as I say, any patrons out there, commission music from Paul. His work, in my opinion, really does encapsulate what's needed today in the liturgy. So Paul, give us your contact details.
pauljernberg.com, and Jernberg is Jernberg. So pauljernberg.com is the easiest way. There's also Magnificat Institute.org. So either of those places, you can just go to the contact page, and it's very easy to reach me.
Terrific. Okay, Paul Jernberg, fascinating once again, and I can't wait till the next time, and see you soon.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.